You are the only animal on this planet that can choke on its own dinner. Not because you are clumsy, because your throat was rebuilt. Every other mammal can breathe and swallow at the same time. You cannot. A dog drinks and breathes in one motion. A horse can gallop and swallow. You have to stop. Here is the number that should stop you. In the United States alone, choking sends around 100,000 people to emergency rooms every year. 100,000. From eating. No other species has that problem. We built it into ourselves on purpose. And we did it for one reason. So that you could make the sound of the letter E. That is the trade. A throat that cannot fail, swapped for a mouth that can say anything. Every layer of this is stranger than the one above. Let's go. Let's start with the throat because the throat is where the bill arrives. Look at how a normal mammal is plumbed. Air comes in the nose, food comes in the mouth. For most animals, those two roots barely meet. The voice box sits high in the neck. The flap above it locks up into the nasal passage. That makes a sealed tube from nose to lungs, running past the food, not through it. The animal breathes and eats at once, and nothing crosses over. Human babies do this too. For about the first 6 months, the voice box sits high. That is why a newborn can feed and breathe without pausing. Then something odd happens. The whole structure starts to move down. By the age of 3 or 4, it has dropped well below where it started. You now have one shared pipe. Air and food take the same corridor. There is a flap on top that shuts when you swallow, and it is fast, and it is not perfect. Miss the timing by a fraction and the food goes into the airway. So why on earth would a body do that? Because dropping the voice box makes the space above it much larger. And that space is an instrument. Think of the mouth and throat as a tube you can reshape, a resonator. A high voice box gives you a short tube with one bend, limited shapes. A low one gives you 2 chambers, roughly equal in length, meeting at a right angle. The tongue sits in the corner of that bend and can change both chambers at once. That geometry is what lets you produce the full range of vowels. Say the vowel in beat, now the vowel in boot, now the one in bat. Your tongue just moved to 3 completely different positions in about 1 second. Each position changes the shape of both chambers. Each one comes out as a different sound. Philip Lieberman spent decades on exactly this. His argument was blunt. The vowels you use are a product of a throat shaped like a right angle, and no ape has one. So the price of the vowel space was a shared pipe. We accepted a permanent risk at every meal to widen the sound library. That is not a small trade. Evolution does not usually take that deal. Now look at the size of the toolkit we bought. Across all human languages, there are roughly 600 distinct consonants, and about 200 vowels. No language uses them all. Each one picks a set. English runs on about 44 sounds. Rotokas in Papua New Guinea gets by on 11. 11. A whole language. At the other end sits Ta in southern Africa with more than 100, clicks included. Dozens of them. Same mouth, same throat, same brain. The hardware is identical everywhere. The selection is arbitrary. And a baby can learn any of them. For about the first year, an infant hears every contrast in every language on Earth. By 12 months, that ability has narrowed to the language around it. Not because the ear got worse, because the brain stopped listening for the rest. Now the second layer, and it is not in the mouth at all, it is in your chest. Talking is a breathing task before it is a mouth task. Watch what you do when you speak. You take a fast breath, about half a second. Then you let it out slowly and precisely for 5, 8, sometimes 10 seconds. The whole time you are holding the pressure steady while the sound comes out. That is not how a resting animal breathes. Resting breathing is even, in and out, 12 to 20 times a minute. Speech takes that rhythm and completely overrides it. A chimpanzee cannot do this. It can call, loudly, but it cannot meter a call. And there is a place in the skeleton where you can see this ability appear. The nerves that run your rib muscles pass through a canal in the spine. Fine control over those muscles needs more nerve, and more nerve needs a wider canal. Anne McLarnon measured those canals across fossils and the result is clean. Take the Turkana Boy, a young Homo ergaster from about 1.5 million years ago. His thoracic canal is narrow, narrower than yours relative to his size. Whatever he did with his voice, he was not metering breath the way you are right now. Now measure a Neanderthal. The canal is wide as ours. So somewhere between 1.5 million and a few 100,000 years ago, the chest changed. The equipment for controlled sound arrives before anything you would call a conversation. Now the third layer, a single small bone. The voice box is not attached to any other bone. It hangs from a horseshoe-shaped bone in the throat. That bone is the hyoid, and it is the only bone in your body that touches no other bone. It is also almost never found. It is small, it is fragile, and it does not survive. In 1983, at Kebara Cave in Israel, a team found one in a Neanderthal skeleton, 60,000 years old, and shaped essentially like yours. Not slightly similar, the same architecture in the same place doing the same job. And there is one from much deeper time, from a young Australopithecus at Dakika in Ethiopia. 3.3 million years old, and it is not like ours at all. It has a bulging pocket in the front, the shape you find in a chimpanzee. That pocket supports air sacs, which make calls louder, and it turns out, less distinct. Somewhere between those two bones, the design changed from loud to precise. Now the fourth layer, and almost nobody thinks about this one, the listening end. A sound system is useless if nothing can decode it. Human hearing is not flat. It is unusually sensitive in a specific band, roughly 1 to 6 kilohertz. That band is exactly where the consonants live. The difference between P and T sits in there. A chimpanzee's hearing is shaped differently, with a dip right in that region. Ignacio Martinez and colleagues worked out the hearing range of the humans at Sima de los Huesos in Spain. Those fossils are about 430,000 years old. The middle ear bones survived, and the geometry of a middle ear tells you its bandwidth. The answer came back as a human pattern, tuned for short consonant sounds. So the ear was ready long before the first stone city. Sender and receiver evolved together. Now stop and ask what any of this was for. Because the answer is not poetry. Robin Dunbar put a number on it that is worth carrying around. Look at how other primates hold a group together. They groom each other. Grooming works, and it has a hard ceiling. It is one-on-one, and it takes time. A monkey in a large troop can spend a fifth of its waking day picking through fur. Past a certain group size, the arithmetic collapses. There are not enough hours. Now count human groups. Hunter-gatherer bands cluster around 25 to 50. The wider network of people you actually know sits nearer 150. That number turns up again and again, in villages, in army units, in address books. So how do you hold 150 relationships together without touching anybody? You talk. Speech is one to many. You can maintain 3 people at once, in the dark, while working. Dunbar's blunt version is that language is grooming that scales. And the content backs him up. Most conversation is not information about the world, it is about people. Who did what? Who can be trusted? Who owes whom? That is not a flaw in human conversation. That is the original function showing through. You were not designed to speak. Every single part of it was borrowed. Read that again because it is the center of this whole story. The lungs were for running, the tongue was for chewing, the lips were for suckling. The voice box was a valve to keep water out of your lungs. Not one component was built for language. All of them were repurposed. That is why the bill is so strange. You did not get a speech organ. You got a food pipe, a breathing rhythm, and a hearing band, all bent toward a new job. Some of you are thinking the anatomy explains it, and that is the whole answer. Fair question. And the answer turned out to be no, and this is the most interesting reversal in the field. For decades, the story was simple. Apes cannot talk because their throats are wrong. Then, researchers took the actual measurements from living monkeys. They mapped the shapes a macaque tongue and throat can make, then modeled the sounds coming out. The result was awkward for everybody. A macaque could produce a usable vowel space, not identical to ours, enough to be understood. Tecumseh Fitch and Bart de Boer ran the models, and their conclusion was clear. The anatomy was never the bottleneck. The brain was. So the throat is the visible half of the story and the smaller half. The thing that never showed up in another animal is control. Deliberate, sequenced, learned control. Now, where does that control come from? Here is where one family in London changed the whole field. In the 1990s, researchers were studying 3 generations of a family, known in the papers as KE. About half the members had a very specific difficulty, not with hearing, not with intelligence. They struggled to sequence the movements of speech. The mouth would not run the program in order. Because the pattern ran through the family, it had to be genetic, and it had to be one place. Simon Fisher and his colleagues found it. One gene on chromosome 7, now called FOXP2. Compare the human version to the chimpanzee version, and the difference is tiny. 2 changed amino acids. 2. Now be careful here because this gene gets oversold constantly. FOXP2 is not a language gene. It does not contain grammar. It builds nothing by itself. It is a switch that controls other genes, and it is heavily involved in fine motor sequencing. It is in songbirds, it is in mice, it is in bats. Put the human version into a mouse, and the mouse does not start talking, obviously. What changes is the wiring in a specific brain circuit and the shape of its calls. So this is not the gene for speech. It is one of the genes for running your mouth in order. And Neanderthals had our version of it. That was sequenced in 2007, and the gene is only half of the brain story. In 1861, a French surgeon examined a patient who understood everything and could say almost nothing. The damage sat in one patch of the left frontal lobe. It carries his name now. 13 years later, a second region turned up, further back, and losing that one does the opposite. Speech stays fluent and stops meaning anything. So production and comprehension are separate jobs, in separate places, joined by a thick bundle of fibers. That bundle is heavier in humans than in any other primate. It is the wiring, not the mouth. Now the 5th layer, and this is the part that flips the picture. Maybe it did not start with sound at all. Watch 2 people talk with the sound off. The hands never stop. Gesture is not decoration on top of language, it is welded to it. People gesture on the telephone where nobody can see them. Blind speakers gesture too. Michael Corballis argued for years that the whole system started in the hands. The logic is strong. A gesture is visible, it can point, and it can copy a shape directly. You can show someone a rock, a direction, and a throw with no sound and no agreement in advance. And we know a hand system can carry a complete language because it does. Sign languages are not simplified. They have grammar, tense, wordplay, and dialects. They are acquired on the same timetable as speech by children who see them. So the question is no longer whether hands can do it. They can. The question is why we moved the job to the mouth. The answer is probably boring and practical. Hands were busy. You cannot carry a load and gesture. You cannot gesture past a bush. You cannot gesture in the dark, and half of life happens in the dark. Sound goes around corners. Sound works while you carry, walk, and dig. So the channel moved, and the hand stayed on as a permanent second track, which is why you still use them. Now look at what the rest of the animal kingdom actually managed, because it is not nothing. A honeybee comes back to the hive and dances a figure of 8 on the comb. The angle of the dance encodes direction relative to the sun. The duration encodes distance. That is a coordinate system, performed by an insect, and it works. Vervet monkeys have separate alarm calls for a leopard, an eagle, and a snake. 3 calls, 3 completely different escape routes, and the young take months to get them right. Prairie dogs go further. Their calls carry information about size, color, and speed of an intruder. Dolphins have signature whistles. Each animal has one, and it functions like a name. So other species have signals, learning, and even something like names. Look at what none of them have. Not one of them can combine. A bee cannot say the flowers were there yesterday. A vervet cannot say a leopard was here last week. Every one of those systems is locked to the present and to the visible. There is no past tense anywhere in the animal kingdom. That is the whole difference. Now the animals we tried to teach, because that experiment ran for 40 years. Washoe, a chimpanzee, learned around 350 signs. Nim managed about 125. Kanzi, a bonobo, worked with nearly 400 symbols on a board. Those are real numbers, and they are not nothing. Comprehension was genuinely impressive. Kanzi followed spoken requests he had never heard before. But look at what never appeared. Not once, in 4 decades. No grammar, no embedding, no sentence inside a sentence. 2 signs together, sometimes 3, then a ceiling. A 2-year-old human goes straight past that ceiling with nobody teaching them. That is the gap. Not vocabulary, structure. Now the experiment, because everything so far is bones and inference. For an actual test, you need a group of people with no language, left to sort it out. You cannot run that on purpose. It happened by accident, in Nicaragua, in living memory. Before about 1977, deaf children there were mostly isolated in hearing families. Each child had a small set of homemade gestures, useful, but not a language. Then schools opened, and for the first time, hundreds of those children were in one place. Nobody taught them a sign language. The staff were teaching lip reading, and it was not working, so the children did it themselves in the yard. The first group pooled their gestures into a shared system. Communication improved immediately, but it was rough. Word order wandered. There was no consistent grammar. Then the second group arrived, younger children, learning that rough system as their first language. And they did something the first group had not done. They tightened it. Judy Kegel and Ann Sangus documented what happened next in detail. The younger signers broke motions into parts and recombined them. They introduced consistent agreement, so a verb pointed at who did what. They built a rule where the first group had a habit. Read that again. The children who received an unfinished language finished it. Not a committee, not a teacher, children, in a schoolyard in under 2 decades. That is the closest thing to a controlled experiment this field will ever get. It tells you the machinery is not a set of rules handed down, it is a builder. Give it fragments and it will construct the missing grammar, whether you asked for it or not. Now put that against the archaeology, because bones and yards are not the only evidence. Symbols leave traces, not many, but real ones. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, there are lumps of ochre with deliberate crosshatch cut into them. 73,000 years old and repeated in the same pattern on separate pieces. Repetition is what matters. A one-off scratch is an accident. A pattern is a convention. Then the beads, small shells drilled through, worn smooth where a cord ran. Around 100,000 years old at sites in Israel and Morocco, a bead is a strange object. It has no use. You cannot cut with it or eat it. Its entire function is to be seen and to mean something to whoever sees it. That is a message sitting on a body, waiting to be decoded. Language of a kind, in shell. And what do these dates give us? A floor, not a date of birth. They say symbolic behavior was normal by then. They do not say when the first word happened. Now here is the honest part, and it is the part most videos skip. Nobody knows when the first sentence was spoken, and nobody is going to know. Sound does not fossilize. Grammar does not leave a layer. The estimates run from about 100,000 years to over 500,000, and the argument is live. What we have is a set of arrivals. The chest by a few 100,000 years ago, the ear by 430,000, the hyoid by 60,000 and probably far earlier, the gene shared with Neanderthals, so older than the split between us. Every piece was in place long before anything was written down. So, what ended it? Silence. Not gradually. Once a group has words, silence never comes back. And look at what a working language does to a group, in numbers. An adult knows somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 word families. A young child adds words at a rate of roughly 10 a day for years. 10 a day, with no lessons, from overhearing. Speech runs at about 150 words a minute in conversation. And here is a measurement I did not expect. Researchers compared languages for information rate. Some languages have fast syllables and simple ones. Others are slow with dense syllables. The syllable rates differ enormously. The information rate barely moves. Across 17 languages, it came out near 39 bits a second, over and over. Different mouths, different grammar, same throughput. The channel has a speed limit and everybody hits it. And count what came out of the whole business. There are about 7,000 languages alive right now. 7,000. Half of them have fewer than 10,000 speakers. Roughly one falls silent every 2 weeks. 7,000 separate solutions to one problem, all running on the same throat. Now the price, in numbers, because there is always a price. You cannot breathe and swallow at once, and that costs 100,000 emergency visits a year in one country alone. You have no air sacs, so your call carries less far than a chimpanzee's. You are the only ape whose infants cannot feed and breathe once they pass their first year. And the deepest cost is one you cannot see. Words replace the thing itself. A forager who has a word for a plant no longer needs to relearn the plant. That is enormous efficiency, and it is also a filter. You get the label instead of the encounter. So what if we have the whole thing backwards? What if language is not what makes you clever? What if it is what makes you copyable? An idea inside one head is worth nothing when that head is gone. An idea that can be said out loud outlives the person who had it. Look at what that changes. Every generation stops starting over. The fire technique, the plant, the root, the 10 years of watching animals, all of it becomes portable. That is what a language is for. Not to express your feelings, to move knowledge between bodies without losing it. And look at what the same machinery does when you give it almost nothing. It gave us Nicaragua, a yard full of children with fragments, building grammar in 20 years. That is not a species with a language. That is a species that cannot stop making one. We traded a throat that could not fail for a mouth that could say anything, and most of us never even knew there was a bill. So the next time you take a mouthful and cough on it, notice what is actually happening. That is not a design fault. That is the cost of being able to say what you mean. Now I want to hear from you. What is the one word in your language that has no clean translation into any other? Put it in the comments. I want to see how many of them are about feelings.